От них действующий президент Соединенных Штатов, новый президент, вновь избранный президент. У него руки свободны, он свободен от этих пут, которые не дают двигаться вперед и работать в сторону разрешения конфликта. Поэтому он, ну и в характере, наверное, он действует прямолинейно и без особых стеснений. Вот у него положение уникальное. Он не просто говорит то, что думает, а он говорит, что хочет. Ну, что же, это привилегия лидера одной из крупных великих держав.
We're also open for dialogue with the new US administration on the Ukrainian conflict. The most important thing here is to eliminate the fundamental reason for the conflict. That's the most important. And as for settling the situation itself, its goal should be not a brief ceasefire, not just getting some time to regroup and rearm and carry on the conflict, but long-term peace based on respect to lawful interests of all people and nationalities living in the region. And of course, we're going to fight for the interests of Russia and its people. This is actually the goal and point of the special military operation.
We have the greatest military equipment in the world. We're building it. At some point, when things settle down, I'm going to meet with China, and I'm going to meet with Russia, in particular, those two, and I'm going to say there's no reason for us to be spending almost $1 trillion on military. There's no reason for you to be spending $400 billion. China's going to be at 400 billion. We're at $1 trillion. We're going to be at close to $1 trillion. And I'm going to say we can settle this on, we can spend this on other things. We don't have to spend this on military and I'm going to be meeting with China. You know, we were trying to de-escalate nuclear, and I was in a position where Russia had agreed and China.
Hours away from a congressional hearing examining if the Biden-Harris administration weaponized the Justice Department for political purposes. Some of the instances we're expected to hear about are the Crossfire Hurricane investigation into Russian collusion, the multiple FISA warrants targeting former Trump advisor Carter Page, and the alleged suppression of the investigation into the Biden family. Former Assistant FBI Director Chris Swecker will be testifying at the hearing. Will join us now. Chris, there are investigations that look political that aren't, and there are ones that look political and were. First off, on the ones you think were, Crossfire Hurricane, does that file under the yes, it was political?
No doubt about it, Brian. I mean, when you look back at the origins of Crossfire Hurricane, and the DOJ Inspector General said this, it was an unpredicated investigation. That means that there wasn't sufficient facts to open up a full FBI investigation. So that, you know, we know now, Peter Strzok, Page, McCabe, Comey, they had a personal animus towards Donald Trump. And if you remember the text between Page and Strzok, we will stop him. And that just resonates in my mind, and it did at the time when I heard about it. That's personal animus. That's injecting your own personal opinion and politics into a full FBI investigation that it turns out wasn't predicated. Then they went on to lie on FISA applications using that discredited Steele dossier. That would have never happened under an FBI that wasn't led by Jim Comey. I can guarantee you that.
This is what a life of a real FBI director looks like. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I start my coffee and I check my Border Patrol app to see how many people I get to deport today. Skip the shower, fix my tie, and now I'm ready. On the way to work, I have a sensible donut, sip my coffee, and listen to the police scanner for any crime. At 6 o'clock, it's time to get to work. I walk through the Hoover building checking under the desk for anyone crying. Those people go straight to jail. At 12 o'clock, I have a lunch break. The leftover chicken marsala give me the energy to finish the day. At 1 o'clock, I like to call Adam Schiff's cell phone and play a recording of a clock ticking. At 5 o'clock, it is time to go home. I slap Dan Bongino's ass and say good game. When I get home, I eat more chicken marsala and then go to bed with my deck of cards. And that is...
I have a killer show for you today. Jerry, you can't knock me off my game. I'm sitting here crying, laughing. It's so good. I want to watch more. It's like a sitcom. I want to watch the full sitcom of Kash Patel's Day in the Life, of an FBI agent, the FBI director, Day in the Life. Jerry, that's a work of art. Oh, man. Let's make sure that sucker gets tweeted right freaking now.
There he is in all his glory. The boss dog. We're out getting him exercised today. So let's get into the video. Watching the world burn, watching the world burn. February 25th, 2025. Let's get into it. Now I played that clip up front because the theme of this video, and if you want to tune out, is we're going to talk about the Ukraine war. There's an excellent article published by Glenn Diesen that I want to read to you. It's very long, so it's going to be kind of boring, you know, for me to just be sitting here reading to you, but I've got some clips. You know, a lot of people, you know, think that, you know, Putin is the warmonger, and, you know, and that the Republicans are warmongers. Okay, George Bush was a warmonger. I agree. He's a criminal. Should be in jail. Killed over 1 million Iraqis for no reason. Said they had weapons of mass destruction. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction. But when you look back through history, who started most of the wars? Think about it. Or who got us into war? Mostly Democrats. Lyndon B. Johnson, he propagated, you know, Kennedy wanted to get us out of Vietnam. Johnson threw us in there. Killed 56,000 American troops. FDR, World War II, got us in that. World War I, I was a Democrat. You know, so you could just go on. And here Trump is just trying to stop the killing in peace. So here's a Democrat, just to verify what I'm saying. Here's Bernie Sanders talking about how we need to continue to kill Ukrainians.
I do not want to hear one Republican come to the floor of the Senate and talk about freedom unless that senator has the guts to call out Trump for the lies that he is telling about Putin and the war in Ukraine. Mr. President, it was Russia that started the war, not Ukraine. It is Putin who is the dictator, not Zelensky. This country must not align itself with Putin and authoritarianism. We must fight for democracy all over the world.
All right, so that was Bernie Sanders. Then, of course, we got Nikki Haley. If I can find the article, I'll put it up.
We need to remind the American people that Vladimir Putin is not our friend. Vladimir Putin is not cool. This is not someone we want to associate with. This is not someone that we want to be friends with. This is not someone that we can trust.
She's crying about the fact that we need to continue the war. We need to kill Ukrainians in bigger numbers. Maybe make them draft kids. You know, let's go down to, you know, when they're 10 years old and send them to the front line. Because they're just Ukrainians. We don't care about Ukrainians, right? I mean, it's not like an American's over there dying or somebody from Europe is dying. No, these are just Ukrainians. Put them on the front line, man. Kill them all. You know, that's a Democrat philosophy there. You know, then we get into, I want to debate free speech for just a minute because I'm an absolutist on free speech. But, you know, okay, you say, well, are there exceptions? There are no exceptions, okay? If you want to yell fire in a theater, you have the right to do that. Now, if it causes a riot and people get hurt, you also have the right to go to jail for starting a riot, okay?
But you have the right to yell fire if you want to. Same with calling in a bomb threat to a school. You have the right to call it in. It's free speech. You're going to go to jail because you wasted government time, government resources, caused people to, probably miss some time in school if you called it into a school or whatever. But that's, then we get into where do you draw the line? All right. So suppose someone says, I'm going to kill you, man. Remember when you were kids? I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you for that. Okay. The question there is it a credible threat? All right. When I was a young kid, telling my brother I was going to kill him, was that a credible threat? No. Do I need to go to jail for that? No. But if somebody right now sends me a text message and says, I'm going to kill you, I have a right to go to the police and say, look, man, you need to investigate this guy. Is this credible or is this just somebody, spouting off? I dare say he's going to be investigated and he could go to jail for threatening me. Same with defamation. Okay, you have the right to call me an asshole, but I have the right to sue you for defamation because it depends on whether people believe that I'm an asshole or not. Or if you want to say things about me that are untrue, I have the right to sue you for defamation. But you have the right to say it. I'm just saying that, expect that there's going to be repercussions. Okay, that's enough on free speech. I wanted to get into the Epstein list for just a minute. That's kind of the next topic, and I want you to leave a comment if you could. All right, am I for the release of the list? I've been giving that a lot of thought. And you know what? I'm really not. And I'm going to tell you why. Suppose there are names on that list that are innocent people. They just, were put on that list because they thought they were going to get them to Epstein Island. Well, the list, is going to imply that they are pedophile or that they, did something wrong. And so the court of public opinion is going to judge that person as guilty, even though they may not have had anything to do with it. They were just on the list. So I think that we should investigate the name on the list to find if there is any evidence of a crime that's been committed. And if we find that evidence, okay, that name, that can be used in a court of law, and of course then their name being on the list is just another thing that for prosecution. All right, so I know that's controversial to not release the list, but there's just a lot of people on X right now that are posting in saying, release the list, release the list. I don't know. I don't think accusing somebody of a crime when hasn't been an investigation or evidence is a good idea, even though I'm sure that most of the people on the list are guilty. The other thing I wanted to talk about was Fort Knox. And I've had a conversation with a friend of mine, my best friend, and we were talking about that. And, is it a good idea to audit Fort Knox and make it public? Well, I'm kind of a truth absolutist. The truth, it is going to come out one way or another most of the time. There are lies that have existed for many years that, we don't find out until the person's long dead. For example, the Kennedy assassination. A lot of lies told about that, but we still haven't, as far as I know, the files still haven't been released on the Kennedy assassination. I don't know why. Hey, by the way, I wanted to point something out before I get into all of that. Do you realize that Trump's first cabinet meeting will be this Wednesday? Think about that. The media and everybody's blaming Trump for inflation. They're trying to blame Trump for everything. He hasn't even had a cabinet meeting yet. What the hell? You can't blame Trump for anything. He's trying to fix everything. But when you think about it, he hasn't even had a cabinet. He's been in such a short period of time, he hasn't even had a cabinet meeting. That's something that just hit me. I was like, wow, I had to think about that. So, but anyway, let's get into Fort Knox again. All right, so let's say you go in and there's no gold there. Would that crash the dollar? I don't know. I'm sure it would shock the world. It'll certainly shock everybody in the United States. But one way or another, that secret's going to come out.
Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red?
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth! Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's gonna do it? You? You, Lieutenant Weinberg?
Eventually. Maybe you just don't want it to come out right now. So, but let's say the opposite happens. You go into Fort Knox and the gold is there. Well, what does that do? It seems to me that would strengthen the dollar, around the world. And maybe, if we can just get the budget under control with, what is it, 26 trillion in debt, or I can't remember. It's such a huge number. If we can get the budget under control, we might be able to save the dollar. And then you hear the Democrats crying about Trump is going to cut Social Security and he's going to cut Medicare. Well, if the dollar goes to zero because you want to spend us into oblivion, there's going to be no Medicare or Social Security or dollars for that matter. How are you going to buy anything unless you've got gold and silver? And I've been on this channel harping on hard assets ever since I have had a channel and on that vein, let's think about Warren Buffett and all the big names. They're all selling their stock, man. You didn't know that. See, the news is so important. Why? I mean, Buffett is sitting on the biggest hoard of cash right now in the history of Berkshire Hathaway. And so is Bezos. He sold a lot of his stock. All the big names are selling a lot of their stock. JP Morgan sold a bunch of his stock. So when you see, this is why paying attention to the news is so important. When you see the big fish selling all their stock, what are you going to do? Well, I'd advise you to sell a little bit of, at least, take some of your winnings and sell it right now, because what do they know that you don't know? They know a lot more than you and me, because why do you think they're billionaires, right? So when the billionaires are making moves, maybe you should follow suit and get into some, and then of course take that money that you sold in the stock and put it in a hard assets. Now, gold being at $29.50, that's but as Lynette Zhang pointed out, if you take all the debt in the world and you revalue gold to what it should be, according to what, the number of dollars that are in circulation, an ounce of gold would be worth $47,000. That's the true valuation of gold. So is $29.50 expensive? Yeah. Should you have bought gold when it was down around $800? Yes. But I want to point out, you still got silver and platinum. All right. Platinum has only increased. I was picking it up for $400 an ounce many years ago. And okay, all your money's tied up in an IRA, or you're tied up in some sort of investment account. Well, there are the Sprott ETFs that you can go into to diversify some of your portfolio into gold, silver, platinum, and you just go to Sprott and you can look up what the ETF ticker symbols are, or they also have mutual funds. And Sprott is, I trust them to have, because it's not like SLV or GLD. Those are derivatives, One share of SLV does not equate to an ounce of silver. But in Sprott, on the other hand, if you read the document or their documentation, they have to have the silver, gold, platinum, palladium on hand to cover everything that gets invested into their ETFs. So it's a pretty safe way, in my opinion. And if you lose all your money, don't blame me, because I might lose all my money, because I do have some there, to divulge it. Anyway, that might be a good way if you can't go out and buy the physical stuff. Like I said, silver's still a good price. It's bouncing between 34 and 32. I didn't look up the price today. It's probably somewhere around in there. Yes, should you have bought when it was $16 or $22, or I was buying it all the way up to in the 28s or so? Right now I'm paying down debt, so I'm not really buying any precious metals, but I have enough to weather the storm if Fort Knox is empty and the dollar goes to hell. All right? The truth is the truth, and you can handle the truth. And on that vein, I did want to talk about Joy Reid losing her job for just 1 second. And, you know, a lot of people say, well, how can you take pleasure in somebody losing their job? For example, a bureaucrat in the government, you know, the ones that were sitting around doing nothing. Or, you know, the names that, you know, Elon saying, you know, send us an email. Let me tell you about my career just for 1 second. I want to talk about that email for just a second, okay? In my career, I had to keep a to-do list and an accomplishments list. And I had to go before management on some jobs, because I was a contractor, on some jobs on a weekly basis and talk about everything that I did in the last week or that we were going to do in the future. All right? That was a weekly meeting where I had to go in and I had to keep my list up to date on everything. Well, asking a federal employee just to send an email, and the reason for it is he thinks there's people on the payroll that don't even check their email or that don't exist. You know, that maybe at one point they were a federal employee and then they left. How are you going to find out if you can't even get them to send an email? So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. All right, we're going to get into the rest of the video here in just a minute. But oh yeah, I was on Joy Reid. Let's finish up that conversation. I'm always happy when a liar gets their comeuppance. And Joy Reid was a racist, and a lot of the stuff that she spewed out was lies, and those lies can hurt people, okay? I mean, how many truths did you believe that have come out and have been refuted? Let's take COVID, for example. You know, at first they were telling us that the COVID shot would give you immunity. Okay, and why aren't the Democrats crying about, because they're crying about federal employees losing their jobs now. What about all the federal employees that lost their jobs because they made it mandatory that they had to get the COVID shot? Where were the Democrats then? My body, my choice, right? Why weren't they crying when all those federal employees lost their jobs? You know, that's just one example of the Democrat hypocrisy that pisses me off. But anyway, and Rachel Maddow, remember when she was propagating that Russia hoax lie day in and day out on Donald Trump? That hurt people, man. That hurt the country. Trump was falsely accused of all that. It really hurt his administration and his ability to get things done for the American people. So that's a propagator of lies. And so anytime somebody that propagates lies loses their position or loses their platform, I'm happy about it. Call me mean, call me whatever. And also on my channel, if I ever get something incorrect, let me know. Okay, and I'll own up to it in the next video. Or if you have an opinion on something that I'm talking about. If I agree with your opinion or disagree, I'll read it on the channel anytime. You know, I'm not going to be right about everything, but I will correct myself. And one thing you can be certain of, I'm not going to lie to you. Ever. At least not a known lie. All right? And then everybody says, well, what are your sources? What are your sources? How many times is your source lying to you? Look at the New York Times. How many times has the CIA planted a story at the New York Times that we later found out was a downright lie? And so you're quoting your source as the New York Times saying, okay, they're the definitive source, therefore it must be true. Or the Washington Post, for example. How many CIA lies have they published? And you quote the Post as your source, and it turns out your source is lying to you, or it's propaganda. Okay, so sourcing everything is not possible a lot of times 100%. And then you say, well, you got to have multiple sources. Well, sometimes multiple sources are long, okay? Because a lot of the time, we all know now that USAID was paying all of the news agencies, and you've seen all the montages where they all spout the same lie, okay? So I could quote, let's see, MSNBC, Fox News, Washington Post, the New York Times, they all said that this is the truth. Therefore, I got 4 sources, and it's got to be the truth. Turns out it was the same lie that was fed to them by the federal government to tell the American people. And so here's my 4 sources that aren't worth the crap. Okay? So all we can do is the best we can to get at the truth as best we can. And then tell people the truth, because if you've got the facts, if you've got the truth, then you can act accordingly and hopefully have a better life or help somebody else have a better life. Let's get into the Ukraine war reading. You know, I always try to get the weird stuff on video. Why would somebody, this is kind of my bench. I had the county put that bench in for me and for anyone, of course, you know, not just for me. I just said this would be a nice spot to read a book. Why did they leave those things there? Okay. It's funny. I swear sometimes these videos make themselves. So I was, well, we're not, you know, we're going to get into the Ukraine war here in just one second, but I was listening, you know, I always listen to Sean Hannity or whoever, you know. I wish I didn't, because I prefer a different channel, but where I'm at in the forest, I only get one news channel, and Sean Hannity, and he does report on some good stuff, even though he parrots the same thing over and over again. Anyway, he had Miranda Devine on, and they were pointing out, you know, talking about the various news agencies, and she made a good point. Now, if you don't know Miranda Devine, she wrote the book Laptop from Hell, which is basically summarizes all the stuff that was on Hunter Biden's laptop. So here's a lie for you that the media got away with. Everybody told you, and remember 51 intelligence officers signed, and so if you were sourcing, well, 51 intelligence officers said that's Russian disinformation. So there's an example of something that would be sourced with 51 people, and it turned out to be a lie. Okay, so, but anyway, so half the country still believes that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. Okay, talk to somebody about it. Say, do you believe the Hunter laptop was real? Talk to a Democrat about it. They'll probably look at you and say, no, that wasn't real. That was a Russia psyop on the United States. They still believe that. So, you know, and then she was talking about the various news agencies. So let's take in, this is why I don't watch CNBC, okay, or MSDNC, because all they do is spew from one perspective everything that they, you know, and most of it's incorrect. And a lot of it's lies. It's just from the left side. And then she was talking about how Fox News, there are a couple of Democrats on Fox News. Now, do I agree with what they're saying? Probably not. Okay, but at least you're getting a balanced opinion, okay? And you form your own opinion. I mean, I call myself a journalist. I'm really not a journalist. I'm an opinion journalist. I mean, and also I don't really, the news that I give to you is just being reported on by other people. I just disseminate it and try to cram it all into these videos, right? So, you know, I guess you could look at me as an opinion journalist, just like Sean Hannity is, okay? But what I'm saying is, it's up to you. I mean, when you watch Fox, the good news is you can see the Democrats' perspective and you can see the Republican perspective, and it's up to you to figure out what you want to believe. That's all that I'm saying. Whereas if you watch MSDNC or even CNN, I mean, you know, now they've got the one guy that's a Republican on there, so they're trying to be a little bit more balanced. And boy, he does a great job. I wouldn't want to sit on CNN. No way, no how. So, you know, so get both perspectives, try to balance it as best you can. Let's get into talking about Ukraine right now. All right, let's get into this. So this was Alan Jacoby, and he was agreeing with me, and I just wanted to read this to you. Keep the Epstein information protected until the DOJ can secure warrants and or evidence that can lead to indictments. I want to see raids, arrests, and indictments, then the list. So, and it goes on from there. This was Insurrection Barbie. I've always got to read from her. No one wants to talk about reforming Medicaid, but let's get real here. Medicare and Medicaid cost us $1.7 trillion every year. That is the amount of the deficit. I think that serious people have serious conversations. We're going to go bankrupt if we don't cut down the spending. That's what I was talking about. Democrats don't want to cut the spending. I don't understand it. You do understand that if you bankrupt the United States, there is no more Medicare, there's no more Medicaid, and there's no more Social Security. Think about that. Suppose everybody in the United States will lose their Social Security because the Democrats won't cut spending. All right, so the correct approach is to out as much of the discretionary spending as possible, then take the difference and split it between Medicaid and defense spending. Because if we don't cut down the federal deficit, Americans won't survive. We cannot sustain these levels of spending, which goes back to the Fort Knox story, that we were talking about. Do we want the truth? This is Slat 71. Because we're getting into Ukraine now, the rest of the video, if you want to cut it off right here and you don't want to hear about Russia and Ukraine, then, you're welcome to do so. Russia gets the honor of victory. The land, the people, the natural resources, and a secure border. The USA gets what essentially a payback for their investments. The Europeans are left with a country that will resemble Germany after World War I, devastated, with traumatized civilians and soldiers, corrupt politicians and their networks, as well as radical forces, including neo-Nazis, and the remaining debts. And for what? For their endless greed, believing they could also be a world power. Ukraine gets what politicians have chosen and brought to it, a defeat. And a lot of dead Ukrainians, unfortunately. That's why when Lindsey Graham gets up there and says, we're going to fight to the last Ukrainian, I just think that's evil, man. That dude is evil. That's all I got to say. And anyway, let's keep going here. We already did Bernie Sanders. So now we're going to get into the crux of this article. This is by Glenn Diesen. If you want to look him up, or Diesen, D-I-E-S-O-N. Anyway, so this is going to be a long read, okay? And if you don't, like I said, if you want to cut it off here. For almost 3 years, NATO countries have boycotted diplomatic contacts with Russia, even as hundreds of thousands of men have died on the battlefield. The decision by diplomats to reject diplomacy is morally repugnant, as diplomacy could have reduced the excess of violence, prevented escalation, and even resulted in a path to peace. However, the political media elites skillfully sold the rejection of diplomacy to the public as evidence of their moral righteousness. That's why I played you that video of Bernie Sanders. And a lot of the Democrats are coming out and saying, well, if we don't support Ukraine, the path to peace Trump is a Putin lover. I hate all that bull crap. What's wrong with peace? Right? Anyway, let's keep going. This article will first outline how NATO planned for a long war to exhaust Russia and knock it out from the ranks of great powers. Second, this article will demonstrate how political media elites communicated that diplomacy is treasonous and war is virtuous. NATO's long war. To exhaust Russia in a long war, the goal was to ensure that the Russians and Ukrainians kill each other for as long as possible. The U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, outlined the U.S. objective in the Ukraine war as weakening its strategic adversary. This is the quote, "We want to see Russia weaken to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine." And then, of course, he sources that. In late March 2022, Zelensky revealed in an interview with The Economist, there are those in the West who don't mind a long war because it would mean exhausting Russia, even if it means the demise of Ukraine and comes at the cost of Ukrainian lives. I'm saying upwards of 2 million. The Israeli and Turkish mediators confirmed that Russia and Ukraine agreed to the terms of a peaceful settlement in Istanbul, in which Russia would withdraw its forces and Ukraine would restore its neutrality. However, why would the U.S. and its allies accept that Ukraine return to neutrality, when the alternative was to use the powerful proxy army that they'd built in Ukraine to bleed and weaken Russia? The Turkish foreign minister acknowledged that there are NATO member states that want the war to continue. Let the war continue and Russia gets weaker. They don't care much about the situation in Ukraine, and he sources that. The former Israeli prime minister also confirmed that the United States and the UK blocked the peace agreement as there was a decision by the West to keep striking Putin. To destroy a strategic rival, sourced again, the retired German general Harold Kujat, a former head of the German Bundeswehr and a former chairman of the NATO Military Committee, also argued that this was a war deliberately provoked by NATO, while the United States and the UK sabotaged all paths to peace to weaken Russia politically, economically, and militarily. That's a quote, and he sources it. Interviews with American and British leaders in March of 2022 revealed that a decision had been made for the conflict to be extended and thereby bleed Putin, as the only end game now is the end of the Putin regime. Sourced again. Chas Freeman, the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and Director for Chinese Affairs at the United States State Department, criticized Washington for the objective to prolong the fighting to fight to the last Ukrainian. Sourced again. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham argued that the U.S. was in a favorable position as it could fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. And then this is a quote from Lindsey Graham. I like the structural path we're on here. As long as we help Ukraine with the weapons they need and the economic support, they will fight to the last person. Unquote, Lindsey Graham. Republican leader Mitch McConnell was similarly explicit, and this is a quote of Mitch McConnell. The most basic reasons for continuing to help Ukraine degrade and defeat the Russian invaders are cold, hard, practical American interests. Helping equip our friends in Eastern Europe to win this war is also a direct investment in reducing Vladimir Putin's future capabilities to menace America, threaten our allies, and contest our core interests. Now, if they had been successful, the world would cease to exist, because Russia stated unequivocally that this was an existential threat to them and that a world without Russia wasn't a world worth living in, implying the fact that they were going to nuke the planet if they lost the war. So be happy that the Russians won the war. Senator Mitt Romney argued that financing the war was the best national defense spending I think we've ever done. Quote, that was a quote, we're diminishing and devastating the Russian military for a small amount of money. I don't know. I don't look at $350 billion as a small amount of money. Do you? U.S. Congressman Dan Crenshaw, I hope we vote this guy out, also celebrated the proxy war as investing in the destruction of our adversary's military without losing a single American troop. Strikes me as a good idea. Yeah, it's a good idea to kill all the Ukrainians. We need to draft down to 10 years old. I mean, they're running out of troops. If we take that draft age down to about 10 and, just stick a light gun in that 10-year-old's hands, we can get them to the front lines. I'm sure we can. Retired U.S. General Keith Kellogg similarly called for extending the war in Ukraine, and knocking out Russia would allow the U.S. to focus on China. If you can't defeat a strategic adversary not using any U.S. troops, you are at the acme of professionalism. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg shared that logic as he argued defeating Russia on the battlefield will make it easier for the U.S. to focus on China. Stoltenberg also noted that, quote, if the Ukraine wins, then you will have the second biggest army in Europe, the Ukrainian army, battle-hardened and on our side, and we'll have a weakened Russian army. Diplomacy as treason and war as virtue. I told you it's a long article. If you stuck with it this long, you've learned a lot. When the decision had been made for a long war, the politicians and media began to construct narratives as a moral cause for a long war, which would convince the public that diplomacy is treasonous and war is virtuous. We've already talked about that. And luckily, Trump believes differently. He believes in peace and he believes in diplomacy. The Democrats don't, okay? Biden never even talked to the Russians for 3 years. Unbelievable. Presenting the world as a struggle of good versus evil lays the foundation for effective war propaganda, as perpetual peace can be achieved by defeating the evil opponent, while negotiations entail sacrificing indispensable values and principles. To this end, the Hitler analogy is very effective, as diplomacy becomes a dangerous appeasement while peace requires military victory. Reminiscent of George Orwell's War is Peace, Stoltenberg argues that weapons are the path to peace. Now, the analogy that they've used quite often was, I can't remember the British diplomat before World War II, and they said, his appeasement of Hitler was what led to the war. I'll get the name up above. Chamberlain, I think it was. The Western public was reassured that fuel in the war was required to push Putin to the negotiation table. However, during almost 3 years of war, the West never proposed negotiations. Reading the Western media, one gets the impression that Russia would not negotiate. However, Russia, and that's why I played that clip up front, Russia never opposed diplomacy or negotiations. It was the West that shut the door. So-called peace summits were held to give the public the impression that governments pursued peace, although Russia was not invited, and the stated purpose was to mobilize public opinion and resources against Russia. If you followed BRICS, Putin laid right in front of the BRICS members the peace plan that he had put together that went over in Istanbul. He even showed them the signatures. So don't tell me Russia hasn't been saying, we're willing to talk, we're willing to have peace the whole time. And Trump's saying right now that we may have peace in the next month. Well, he's saying less than a month. I don't see how that's possible. In fact, I saw something that said May 9th might be too early because, that's going to be Victory Day in Russia. And I was hoping that we would see Putin, Xi, and Trump all together there, maybe not for a peace plan, but at least to celebrate Victory Day. If you don't know, Victory Day is the day that, Russia uses to celebrate the World War II coming to an end. Their victory over Nazi Germany. Oh yeah, Russia didn't fight against the Nazis. No, everybody's forgotten that. In November 2022, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, a traitor I might add, argued for starting negotiations with Russia. Ukraine had captured large swaths of territory in Kherson and Kharkov, and General Milley argued Ukraine would not be in a better position to negotiate a peace deal. General Milley was correct in this assessment. Yet he neglected that principal objective of the war was to keep it going to bleed Russia. General Milley had to walk back his statements that threatened to end the war, and that's sourced. Okay. The EU almost always advocates for immediate diplomacy and negotiations in conflicts around the world. In Ukraine, the EU's foreign policy chief at the beginning of the war, Joseph Borrell, argued that the war would be won on the battlefield. Sourced. The incoming foreign policy chief of the EU, Kaja Kallas, rejected any need for diplomacy during the war. Why talk to him, Putin, if he is a war criminal? Sourced. Diplomacy now entails sitting in a room with people who agree with you and pat each other on the shoulder, for having isolated the adversary. The EU has completed its transition from a peace project to a geopolitical project. I know this is getting long, huh? But I thought, it's a really good article. And anyway, I feel like I'm reading a book to you. Anyone suggesting to restore diplomacy or start negotiations is immediately smeared as a far-left or far-right pro-Russian stooge. It is hardly original to present the opposition to war as taking the side of the adversary. Yet the accusation of treason is a powerful instrument to crush dissent. The Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban traveled to Ukraine, Russia, China, and the U.S. to meet with Trump to explore the possibility of charting a path to peace. The EU responded by punishing Hungary, and the political media elites sought to delegitimize him as a puppet of Putin. How many times have you heard that? I guess I'm a Putin puppet. That's what I am. The same script is applied to anyone suggesting to end the war. We're almost done here. We're almost done. Arguing against the dangerous precedent of rewarding Putin's aggression with territory has been another seemingly moral argument against peace negotiations. However, this argument is based on the false premise that the war began as a territorial dispute. No, it began as a civil war. As we learned from the Istanbul peace agreement, Russia agreed to pull back its troops in return for Ukraine restoring its neutrality. Furthermore, had to check on the dog. Furthermore, the proxy war has been lost, and Ukraine will only lose more men and territory with each passing day. NATO continued insistence that Ukraine will become a member state after the war is presented to the public as a moral sign of support for Ukraine, although in reality as the effect of obstructing a political settlement. Ending NATO expansion must be the cornerstone of a lasting peace agreement, as this was the source of the war. In other words, Biden brought the war on because he said he was going to bring Ukraine into NATO and he was going to give them long-range weapons. Or maybe even, and of course, if you didn't know, Zelensky has asked for nuclear weapons. Good God, thank God we didn't give him nuclear weapons. But I mean, you could see Russia's point. They're probably looking at it going like, Ukraine's going to be part of NATO. And that they always said nit means nit. Ukraine can never be a part of NATO. And as soon as we threatened to bring Ukraine into NATO, that's when Russia invaded, because they felt like they had to. There's an existential threat to the Russian country. Let me pet the dog just a little bit. As the Ukraine front lines collapse and their casualties subsequently intensify, the Americans are pushing Ukraine to lower its conscription age. I was telling you about that, as sacrificing the youth could help the war go for a bit longer. The Ukraine public no longer wants to fight. Desertions increase drastically, and recruitment consists of grabbing civilians off the streets and throwing them into vans that take them almost directly to the front lines. A recent Gallup poll found that there is not a single oblast in Ukraine where the majority support the continuing war. Sourced again. Olisky Aristov, the former advisor to President Zelensky, predicted in 2019 that the threat of NATO expansion would provoke Russia to launch a large-scale military operation against Ukraine. NATO would then use the Ukrainian army to defeat Russia. In this conflict, we've been actively supported by the West, with weapons, equipment, assistance, and new sanctions against Russia, and the quite possible introduction of a NATO contingent, a no-fly zone, etc. We won't lose, and that's good. Yeah, but boy, was that statement wrong. The war did not go as planned, and Ukraine is being destroyed. And the Astrofov, I'll put it up above, recognizes the folly of continuing the war. There is growing realization in Ukraine society that NATO sabotaged the peace to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Ukrainians will resent Russia for decades to come, although there will be hatred against the West. The war propagandists in the Western media will then surely act bewildered and blame Russian propaganda. And then, of course, if you want to read the article, I'll put the link in the description, and he cites all of the sources of where he gathered all of this information. All right, I know this is a long video, but I thought that was just the best article to, fill you in on everything that's taken place. Because, when you're looking at 2 million people dead, God knows how many casualties, and a completely destroyed Ukraine, someday people might want to watch this video to determine what really happened. And as Paul Harvey would say, you've got the rest of the story. Every now and then listening to Sean Hannity, you do get a real good deep dive into a topic. And he just did a huge deep dive into the mRNA technology and the so-called vaccine. And they brought out a fact that I was shocked. And if you didn't know, Dr. Malone, who developed the mRNA technology, he always said that, he actually said it was not meant to be a vaccine at all. And that, and he said it should be used on a limited basis with people possibly with pre-existing conditions, or in, the older portion of the population, maybe above 65. And that was what Dr. Maloney had said, okay? But the fact, though, he said the reason he developed the technology and why this hits home to me was for cancer, okay? They wanted the mRNA shot, or the technology, to go in and identify to your immune system the cancer cells in your body, so that your body will attack the cancer cells. So it was really meant to be a cure or a possible treatment for cancer, and they were only going to try it out on terminally ill people with cancer. Now, the reason I brought that up was because what saved my life was because I had to do a bone marrow transplant, okay, was they took the white blood cells from my body, okay, and they treated them with Rituxan, which is one of the chemical agents they use to treat lymphoma. And after I had the bone marrow transplant, which only gave me a 40% chance of surviving, by the way, they eventually gave me back the white blood cells. And man, I got sick as a dog, and the doctors were all around me clapping and saying, look how sick he is. This is great. This is great, which meant my body was fighting something. You know, they weren't sure if it was the cancer cells or not, but it did. That technology saved my life, and that treatment later went on to become, from what I understand, a somewhat standard treatment for lymphoma cancer. Anyway, I just thought that was a neat factoid. And of course, they talked about, you know, there was another thing that's just has come out because, you know, so many people, well, you know that RFK now has a vaccine injury database that they're redoing so that people can report vaccine injuries, not just from the mRNA technology, but all vaccines. And they're going to start tracking that very closely. So we should get more data in the future. You know, and of course, they pointed out that NBC is still telling people to get the booster, even though they're not a doctor. Talk to your doctor. That's all. I agree with Sean Henry. And then, of course, he said there's actually places where you go for medical treatment that will not treat you unless you've had the jab, which blew my mind. I don't know a place like that, but I guess they still exist here in the United States. I wonder if, you know, remember in Canada, you couldn't fly without having had the vaccine and all that stuff, or even across the border. There was all kinds of stuff. Anyway, just a couple of little factoids. The other thing is vaccine hesitancy has gone way up. I don't know about you, I'll never get a flu shot ever again. And they were pointing out that, you know, some of those childhood vaccines are important, but people have lost all faith and trust in the government, and they're not letting their kids get the necessary vaccines that they might need, you know, because they don't trust the pharmaceutical companies or the federal government. So they really hurt everybody.
Don't take my word for it. Again, it's this. I'm telling you what Putin has said. Let me show you. Here's what Putin did say.
As for other participants, first of all, Russia has never refused contact with Europeans. Russia has never rejected the negotiation process with Ukraine, never. It was our so-called partners in those negotiations who refused. The Europeans cut off contact with Russia, while the Ukrainian side prohibited itself from engaging in negotiations and withdrew from the Istanbul negotiation process, openly and publicly announcing it. Well, we are not forcing anything on anyone. We are ready. I've said this 100 times. If they want to negotiate, they're welcome to do so, and we will be ready to return to the negotiating table.
Now, does that sound like the guy who just wants to cleave the world into a new East and West divide, that wants to conquer anything, who keeps saying over and over, and this is verifiable, it's on the record, West and East, that he's been trying to have this negotiated and get off the table and end the conflict. Ergo, not cleave it into an East and West, not conquer anybody else. And yet, only because I'm showing you on the screen, here's what Putin is saying. This is just a few days ago. And has been saying for years, and I just laid out from 2007 forward to today, one consistent message he has always said. You don't hear any of that in the New York Times. You don't hear any of that from Christiane Amanpour. She didn't push back on it at all.